Thank you very much for joining us again for I think this is our 6th or 7th of the Winter Learning Series, webinar series. We're really glad to have you all tonight. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Ethan Duke from MRBO is also here with us tonight. And our mission at MRBO is the conservation of birds and really all wildlife and their habitats via science, education, and advocacy. And as many folks who are returning to the series tonight know, we have put together these webinars to really inform everybody, take a deep dive into a lot of different conservation topics, and hopefully inspire folks to take action. And the topic tonight is one that it is really fun and really pleasant to take action on. So our friend and colleague, Sarah Kendrick, is coming to us live from Central Missouri. We're really happy to have her and have this deep dive into the ecology behind bird-friendly coffee. Sarah was the state ornithologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation for several years, but is now a migratory bird biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Columbia office. So without further ado, Sarah, my friend, please take it away and tell us about coffee.
Thank you, my friend. If you all don't know Missouri River Bird Observatory, I really encourage you to check them out at mrbo.org. They're a great NGO here in Missouri, great conservation partner. They do nearly all of our grassland bird monitoring in the state, which, as we know, they're one of our fastest declining groups of species. Very important work. So thank you, Dana and Ethan and everyone else at MRBO for all of the good things that you do. So hello, everybody. Thank you. There's so many people on here. It's very overwhelming. But thank you for taking time out of your evening on this holiday to join us to talk about native shade-grown coffee. So again, a huge thanks to MRBO for the invitation to speak. I'm really excited about tonight's presentation, tonight's topic, because I really haven't gotten to delve deep myself, research-wise. I know a lot about it, but there's always more to learn, of course. And it's a really fascinating topic to me, and I hope to you too. I have to give a few caveats at the beginning of this talk. So this is a massive topic with economic tentacles that I will not attempt to explain in many different facets. Economics, further information about the agronomy of growing coffee. I will not go into a ton of detail, but it will hopefully make us think about where our coffee comes from, and if we can make a difference by choosing particular products that really can make a difference for our migratory birds, which are declining quite rapidly. So I have to give a shout out, first off, to my colleague in bird conservation, Ernesto Carmen. He's the founder of cerulean.org. Check that website out. It's really interesting. Ernesto's Costa Rican and involved in many bird conservation projects. And I've worked with him on lots of tagging, modus tagging projects. He's a conservationist, a naturalist, a birding guide. He's an amazing educator, and his family happens to own a coffee farm in Costa Rica. So when I went down to do some modus tagging in Costa Rica, I asked a partner from Colombia, from Bogota, Colombia, hey, do you know any people who grow coffee? Because I really want to learn more about the shade-grown coffee, and I want to learn a lot more about it. And Nick said, oh yeah, the guy we're banning birds with, his family owns a coffee farm. It's like, well, that's very advantageous. So I've learned a ton from him. His family owns a coffee farm called Finca Cristina. You'll see quite a few photos of it because I've gotten to see it and tag birds on it, which is amazing. And I also have to acknowledge Nick Bailey with Selva, which is a nonprofit bird conservation group in Bogota, Colombia. And Nick and I worked together on some modus tagging projects as well. And he sent me a lot of photos for this presentation from Colombia. And so suffice to say that I will not be covering all aspects of coffee. This is the hugest caveat ever. However, it's a big world, but from my research personally, and work with international partners who know it directly, I'm really just providing these high-level findings and observations. So biggest caveat ever. Okay, so I'm a migratory bird biologist. So while I do work on resident birds and migratory birds in the Midwest, at the Midwest scale, I focus on the conservation efforts for migrants with organizations across the country and with international partners, which is just a joy. It's really fun to hear their perspectives and learn from them. But before we begin to get anywhere near coffee, first we have to consider migration and why a bird would evolve to migrate or not. And so when we think about a few of the evolutionary strategies and motivations of being a migrant or a resident bird, which means non-migratory, both have their threats and benefits. So we see this funny cartoon of an American robin, which is how we all feel, not today because it was nice, but I have felt like this the last few weeks. I'm tired of the cold. And So then we see the summer tanager, who luckily gets to spend more than half the year next to bromeliads and trees in tropical climates. And so these are a few examples of our resident birds. This means that they don't migrate, of course. About half of the birds that breed in Missouri are migratory, or they leave the state during the non-breeding season. And so you may notice that a lot of these resident birds, I'll show a few other ones here, you may notice a lot of them come to your feeders because they eat what? They eat seeds, which are very readily available in the winter, whereas insectivorous birds, like many of our warblers and migrant species, they don't have as many insects to eat in the winter, of course. And so some of these overwintering resident species do not eat seeds, like the bluebird, the mockingbird, Carolina wren, but they eat berries, which are all available, as well as small insects when they can find them. So it's just very interesting to think that they're following the insects, following the food in a lot of ways. So there's different varying levels of migration distance. There's a short distance migrant. We might think of the red-winged blackbird or other species that flock up, that kind of move around the landscape looking for food. Maybe in the tropics, in a mountainous area, they will move from lower to higher or higher to lower elevations, depending on dry or wet season. So that's migration as well. There's medium distance migrants like eastern bluebirds, American robins, that may move a state or two. You can see there on the range, the orange is where the birds breed. It's their breeding range. The purple is year round and the blue is wintering range. So you see some of those birds in the northern part of their breeding range may move down to the southeastern states, may come to Missouri. Our birds may move a little bit farther south. A lot of these species are so small, we don't know very much about where they go exactly. They're resident birds. They're generally doing okay. They're not declining very steeply. So we haven't tracked them a lot to figure out exactly where they're going. So long distance migrants, this is kind of what we think about when we think of a migratory bird. These are birds with ranges, breeding ranges that extend from the US and Canada. And then they overwinter from Mexico through Central America, maybe in South America, for up to 8 months of the year. And so there's a vast variety of migration. I know this text is very tiny, forgive me, but notice how different these breeding ranges and overwintering ranges are for forest birds, waterfowl, upland sandpiper down here, which is a grassland bird. And clearly these forest breeding birds like blue-winged warbler, whippoorwill, they're going to forested areas in Central America, whereas our upland sandpiper is a grassland bird and it's going all the way down to the Pampas in southern South Africa. So it is moving very long distance. But you can see how these, look at the winter range of blue-winged warbler up here, as opposed to yellow-billed cuckoo, much larger range. So it's just really fascinating stuff. It's just so different by species. So let's review a few of the threats to both of these species, whether you're a resident or a migrant. So this is not an all-inclusive list, of course, but resident species have to deal with harsh winters. We remember in the winter of 2018-19, I think it was, super harsh winter. There was precipitation, ice and snow on the ground for up to 2 weeks. Lots of bluebirds were found dead. Lots of Carolina wrens were missing, seeming to be missing the following year. They may have taken a hit population-wise because they just couldn't find any berries or food because they often forage on the ground. And so when that ground is covered by snow and ice, those birds are put in a really tough position. It was 2 weeks of sub-zero temperatures. And so freezing and starvation are major threats for resident birds. Habitat removal, of course, which is always a threat, whether you're a resident or a migrant bird. Predators, both natural predators and invasive predators like cats. Window strikes, other collisions, all of those things are around for all birds, in addition to many others. If you're a resident bird, you don't have to migrate. So you can start breeding earlier in the season. So you get sometimes even a few weeks, a few months earlier than some of the migratory breeding birds, but many resident birds are also nesting in cavities, so they have that extra protection from the weather and the cold, but not all of them. So they don't have this long, arduous journey, of course. These are the pros at the bottom. So with a migrant, they're of course risking this long journey. It's energy expensive, it's exhausting. Some of these birds just fall out from exhaustion when they meet landfall, but I'm sure many fall into the ocean as they're migrating over it. Storms they can run into, big tropical storms or otherwise that they get caught in. Sometimes they get blown off course. A lot of the rare birds that we find in the US are birds during migration or young birds that are blown off course and they're not sure where to go or where they are. Droughts can of course affect these birds, like El Nino that's happening right now. And then late and early frosts when they arrive, or late or early frost before they migrate in the fall. So all of these put different pressures and are threats to these birds. Habitat removal too for these birds, but they have two different areas to worry about. They have the breeding site, hoping that their habitat remains, as well as overwintering areas, which we'll learn here that many of those areas face pretty high rates of deforestation. But then even places in between, one of the most unstudied area of these migrant birds' life cycle is migration. We don't have a great way for small birds to track exactly where they're stopping. And some of these birds stop in the exact same place every single year. They're dependent on those mud flats or that wetland. Those shorebirds moving through stop at the same places each year. And if that's removed, then they're kind of put in a bind. They have to find somewhere else to fuel up on migration. Very energy expensive time of their lives. And then of course, predators, same, window strikes, other collisions. Your pros here for a migrant is that you don't have to face harsh winter conditions. I would say that's probably equivalent to migrating over 1,000 miles, risk-wise. But then you find abundant food in the tropics, right? You need all of these insects to eat. And so you're not without a food source if you can make it there and if you can make it back. So long distance migrants, just to give you some context worldwide, there's over 10,000 bird species in the world, but it's about 10,000. About 650 bird species nest in North America. But here in Missouri, we have about 330, give or take 10 or 20 rare birds that are annually present. About half of those breed in Missouri, 84, about 50% leave Missouri in the non-breeding part of the year. And then a third of our birds that breed in Missouri that we think of as our birds leave the US completely in the non-breeding season. And so really, these aren't our birds, they're shared birds between here and the tropics. But let's consider a migrant's annual cycle. So this is a golden-winged warbler, a beautiful bird. Beautiful doesn't even capture. These birds are so gorgeous. And in the background is its range map. So you see the orange is its breeding range, the yellow is migration, and the blue is overwintering. And so when we look at the times of year around the months of its annual cycle, they are only in Missouri and breeding, well, they don't breed here, they breed north of us, but a migrant is only here breeding in North America for 2 or 3 months, 3 months. So that means that they're somewhere else for up to 9 months of the year, either during they're on migration or they're overwintering somewhere else. So really you start to realize that these are not our birds. These are tropical birds that really use us for this flush of vegetation and this flush of abundant life, abundant insects, abundant habitat for them to nest in, for them to fly up here, spread out, defend territories, have their babies, and then have a lot of resources to feed their babies so that they can all make the trek back south. So this is just an animation from eBird from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. eBird is a huge database online of birder sightings. And so these relative abundance maps walk through weeks of the year, and they show you where birds are more and less abundant. So the darker the color, the more abundant the bird is. So you can see this is for wood thrush. You can see the bulk of their overwintering is in the Yucatan, Belize. And then as we move through the weeks of the year, we're getting to migration right now. And then the darker the color is where the birds are more dense. You can see where they breed. And then September, October, they're clumping up and then they hop the Gulf on migration to go back to their wintering sites. Just another example of these long distance migrants that are just truly mind-blowing. This black-poll warbler breeds in boreal forests across, from Alaska all the way through Canada, and it overwinters in South America. So researchers have used small tags to track these birds on migration, and they found that these birds migrate 20,000 kilometers from Alaska to Venezuela, and they weigh 12 grams. So not only are they crossing a continent, they're also hopping out over the Atlantic rather than crossing over land because I don't know why. It's just a strategy that they have evolved with, but it's just truly mind-blowing. And so while these birds continue to blow our minds, they're facing major threats, as many of us know, and most of them are declining rapidly. A study released in 2019, if you're a birder and involved in bird conservation, I know everybody's probably sick of seeing this slide, but in 2019 in the journal Science, this study quantified the net loss of North American birds since 1970. And in truth, we've lost, according to this analysis, about 30% of our birds in North America in the last 30 years. And these are not just rare birds, this even includes common species as well. So you can imagine that finding the causes of decline for 200 plus species, many of which are migratory, is a lot. So here we see some of these declines by year, by habitat guild. You see on the right, All of the bars on the left of the axis in the middle are -% change since 1970. You can see there, I will point out that wetland birds are the only group that has increased due to concerted conservation efforts led by waterfowl hunters, NGOs, and federal funding that was pointed towards wetland and waterfowl conservation. And so conservation works. This is proof in itself, but many of these other groups, especially many of our songbirds, including shorebirds though, and they use wetlands, are declining very rapidly. So again, you can imagine that finding the reasons why are many. And so finding alternative solutions as we go along, there's not one smoking gun for these declines. We have to be nimble and we have to be flexible. And so finding different ways to help birds, like market-based solutions, like native shade-grown coffee, are really key to helping any way that we can. So this news of the bird declines made a huge media splash, reaching over 1,700 media outlets and a reach of like 3.8 billion people. That's a lot. That's a lot for a conservation story about birds. Out of that reach, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, NABC, it's a group of groups, agencies, NGOs across North America, and they work to reach the public, trying to motivate them to do something about these declines. Now, humans are a pretty selfish species, so they literally named these "Why Care About Birds," relating to human values, like property values and clean water, and they support your health. Being outside and being around birds and in nature reduces stress. It's better for your health. Birds are good for the economy. Bird watching generates $100 billion in economic activity. It's huge. And so you can see one of those is pest control by birds in coffee and wine industries. So if that's what motivates you, this talk is just going to blow your socks off. So what is causing declines? I get this question all the time. Well, that's terrible, but why? What can we do about it? And as I just mentioned, you can imagine that it's a lot because there's many, many different species. And each of these species has a different life strategy. You saw from the migration maps, they overwinter in different places. And so however, there are some large changes that have happened over the last 50 years that are pretty commonly assumed to be affecting this in some way. Land use change, habitat removal or degradation, deforestation on the wintering grounds and in other locations too. Collisions with windows and buildings, pesticides, the use of pesticides has ramped up a lot since the 90s. And then cats, free roaming and feral, the largest human-caused threat to birds. So you can imagine that these questions multiply again when we're considering migratory birds that spend more than half their life where we are not, somewhere else. Cornell Lab of Ornithology used their marketing and communications teams to create a marketing strategy they developed for calls to action when this paper was released to show what people can do to help birds in the face of the declines. And one of them is drink shade-grown coffee. So here we go. I'm doing that. I'm trying to fulfill my charge. So here we are finally at the topic at hand, talking about coffee. And so over the last few years, I've worked with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and eBird to create a series of maps by state that show priority migratory bird species that breed in that state. To help us identify highest priority overwintering sites, we took these high priority birds and overlapped their winter ranges to show where we'd get the most conservation bang for our buck to invest in international partnerships like these. And so it just so happens that this range, at least for Missouri and many other states, overlaps nearly completely with the coffee belt, where coffee is grown in the Western Hemisphere, not in the whole world, but in the Western Hemisphere, this is where coffee is being grown. And look how it is essentially identical to the winter ranges overlapping of Missouri's priority birds. So when we think about, let's just imagine something. Let's think about all the breeding birds that use forest and otherwise, but we'll just focus on forest breeding birds. Imagine all the boreal migratory birds they're breeding in the entire boreal, all through our Ozarks, all across eastern forest, Appalachia, all of those migratory breeding species overwintering, smashing into this relatively very skinny landmass from Mexico down to South America. All of those birds breeding spread out on territories in the the non-breeding season. They're not caring as much about territories, so they're all smashing into tropical forest. And so it makes threats to those areas that much more important to address. So this part of the world also hosts many biodiversity hotspots, of course, due to their tropical climate, their ability to support many more niches of organisms than our temperate climates can. So, and this is why, because of tropical forest, at least for forest breeding birds. So these are examples of pictures I've taken of Costa Rican mid-elevation forest. And so many of our migratory songbirds need this particular elevational band up mountainsides. Not high elevation, not the lowlands, but that sweet spot right in the middle. You can think of all those birds we just talked about smashed into these habitats that breed, these birds that breed across the US and Canada, smashed into this tiny area. I used to think that these birds would fly down south to tropical areas and just use any old forest and just gorge all winter long. Well, we're finding that that's not really the case. Not only are these birds constrained to that small skinny landmass, that's Latin America, but even within that, they are constrained to a particular elevational gradient, making this topic and habitat conservation for these birds in particular even more important. So, okay, I'm going to give you the highest level coffee primer you've ever received. But as of a few years ago, this information was relatively new to me, and so I will share it with you, of course. And we need to know about coffee to talk about shade coffee. So coffee, the coffee plant, is native to Somalia, Ethiopia, and Yemen. It's native to Africa. It was introduced to Latin America by Dutch traders in the 1700s as a forest floor crop under a dense canopy. Okay, so it grows really well under shade, and that's how it was traditionally grown, as a shade plant for many, many centuries. So coffee grows cherries, a coffee cherry or a coffee berry, whichever you want to go with. I'll just keep calling it a berry. But it has seeds inside, surrounded by a mucousy flesh that's slightly sweet. And the seeds inside are then what is dried, roasted, and that we see eventually as coffee beans. You can see the process up there on the top right. Ernesto took this photo. You can see the cherry, then it's surrounded by this mucousy, slimy, it's very slippery. And then it sits in a water bath while during processing, the coating is taken off. The seeds in the berries sit in a water bath, and then they're dried in the sun or in blow dryers that dry it off, and then the bean is roasted, and then we grind it up and drink it. So here's the difference between shade-grown coffee and what we'll call sun coffee. So this is shade-grown on the left, and we see full sun on the right, of course. Now, prior to the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, shade-grown was a traditional way to grow coffee. We just covered that, right? It was introduced as a shade plant. But around the 70s, coffee farmers were under a lot of pressure to produce more coffee. And so many started planting different coffee varieties that grew in the sun. And in Latin America, listen to this stat. In Latin America, 50% of coffee plantations were converted to sun or low shade plantations from 1970 to 1990. So in 20 years, 50% of coffee plantations moved from shade-grown to open sun. Land conversion rates at this time varied from about 15% in Mexico to 60% in Colombia. So we're talking about a lot of habitat removal. So again, during this talk, I'm mostly speaking from my research in Latin America and partners in Latin America, predominantly Costa Rica and Colombia. I can't speak about African coffee economies or anything else. And that's from speaking with biologists and coffee growers. And so I encourage you to do more research on this topic elsewhere. It is really fascinating. So here are a few other photos of coffee grown in full sun. You can see they're on the sides of mountains here. So tough to access, very steep. And it may look kind of similar in this form, sun coffee, to our monocultures, corn and soy. And so as we know from corn and soy, this doesn't really provide habitat for species in an otherwise, like the tropics, very biodiverse part of the world. So you can see how this is additional habitat removed because it's supporting so much life. So these are just kind of cool. I found these on open commons sites of historic pictures of coffee farms. But this is a historic photo from the 1950s from a coffee farm in Costa Rica. Look at all that shade. You know, when we look at this, I don't really see a coffee farm. I see habitat, right? It looks like a forest. And that coffee, which you see here, these shrubs, are growing under native shade, big trees too. And so that's really interesting and exciting to see that's how it can look sometimes. This is a little bit more sparse shade, but at least it's shade. This is from a coffee plantation in Puna, Hawaii. This picture they estimate was taken between 1883 and 1905. I just think these pictures are so cool. However, even in these old photos, these are both from the early 1900s, you can see open sun coffee plantations without shade or sparse shade. You can see on the right there from Hawaii, which is better than nothing. At least you're providing some habitat over top. But this is why this matters. So in the sun-grown coffee, this image is from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute, which does a lot of research on shade coffee. And in just open sun coffee bushes, you can find about 61 bird species. I mean, it is the tropics. You're still going to find a good number of birds there. Partial shade, 79 bird species. This is from fieldwork in Peru. But with bird-friendly shade-grown coffee, which is a certification program by the Smithsonian, which I'll talk about later, very thick shade, diverse vegetative structure, they've counted 243 bird species, which just blows your mind. And it shows a real difference, especially with this certification. And so because you're providing habitat and those multiple strata for birds to forage over top, it speaks for itself. This is all birds, though. This is endemic and native to Latin American birds, but just migrants. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology and their research has found that among 42 migratory songbird species known to overwinter in coffee, more than half, 22 of them, have significantly declining populations. This is a slide from the American Bird Conservancy, who does a lot of work with NGOs directly in Latin American countries for bird conservation, including sustainable ag practices like sustainable grazing practices, shade coffee, shade cacao, and lots of other areas of interest. And so oftentimes you don't see whole mountainsides cleared and denuded of tropical forest for these ag commodities. Sometimes you do, but not often where I've seen. But you do see these small bits taken out on the side of hills that you see here in the picture to grow commodity ag products. Now we have to keep in mind, well, we'll get to that in a second. Here in Spanish, I will translate it. It says migratory bird species need functional landscapes, not only reserves. So while reserves are great to set aside habitat that no one can touch, that's just not realistic in a lot of these parts of the world where people are working the land. You know, they own a lot of the land. Reserves are a small percentage of the landscape. It's just not enough. And so the other box says we need to integrate conservation into production systems, into these ag systems. And it's so true. So you can see here in this picture, this is shade coffee. You can see the coffee plants down here under this just thick, thick shade. This is a picture from Colombia. That really, we're not only looking at coffee being grown here, we're looking at habitat. That's how I see it anyway. So these are some of the pictures of some of the things that we're kind of seeing, well, that many people are seeing, not just me. But this is a picture from Finca Cristina, the coffee farm that Ernesto's family owns. And this is just the view out from their farm. So this is from standing in their farm. And this is kind of what they're surrounded by. This is the Central Valley in Costa Rica, huge agricultural part of the country. It's in a valley, it's fertile soils. And you just see these chunks of the mountainside taken out, right, for grazing and for a lot of different commodities. This is a picture from Colombia. It's kind of the same trend, is that these chunks of forest are taken out and these are being grazed. I mean, this is grazing lands, and they're not raising mountain goats. They're cattle on these things, which is just wild. But it's crazy when you look across that landscape, how much that forest is missing. And it would have traditionally been forest. So coffee shrubs bloom for a very short time. They have these white blooms that smell like jasmine. Oh, wait, I haven't shown you the blooms yet. Here, I'll show you this picture. So this is a picture we were there in the small period of time when the blooms are on. But these blooms are only fertile for 2 days. And so after the dry season, there are these big heavy rains. And 12 days later, says Ernesto, the blooms pop on the plants. And it just, everything smells like jasmine. The coffee looks all white and snowy. And it blooms and it's fertile. And so for a long time, it was thought the coffee was self-pollinating. But when you compare two farms that do and do not host pollinators and who have overstory canopy and lots of different plants for insects to eat on, you'll get the same amount of berries comparing a non-shade coffee compared to full sun coffee. So you'll get the same number of berries, which at face value may not seem that much more productive. But in areas with lots of insects with more diverse tree species and the biodiversity on the farm, more insects and birds to pollinate, you grow more seeds inside the berry, which you see here. So the most frequent, as he says here, is 2 beans, 2 seeds per cherry. That's a pea berry is actually low quality because it's only creating 1 seed. And so it's a genius marketing scheme that sometimes you see pea berry coffee for sale as like a delicacy when really it's the lower quality coffee that they're selling as pea berry coffee, which is just kind of funny when you learn about it. But the heavily pollinated areas can have up to 3 seeds. And so you're increasing yield with that increased pollination. So here's those blooming coffee plants. And so because that coffee plant is not native to Latin America, few insects in Latin America actually eat it or bother it or are pests. And so it's a bit of a misconception to farmers in the area that you want to keep the insects away from your coffee. And so they use, pesticides and other things like that. And so coffee produces caffeine, of course, as protection against insects. And Latin American insects are not adapted to coffee, so they really don't bother it too much. But one pest that, of course, has adapted with coffee is the coffee borer beetle, which is from Africa, where coffee is native. And so it has made its way to Latin America. It bores into the coffee cherry. You can see there, it's very tiny. Bores in, it kind of ruins the seed. And look how tiny this coffee borer is. And so birds, and particularly warblers, eat this coffee borer beetle. So the more birds you have, the more natural pest control. And of course, shade helps your coffee because it also provides a less harsh environment from the elements. It acts kind of as an umbrella and it holds in that moisture, which of course helps as well. Also, the foliage falling off of the trees over top work as compost and a natural fertilizer for a lot of your coffee plants. So you don't have to spend money on artificial fertilizers. So when we look at benefits to birds, we've seen this already. We've seen like the bushy tree covered habitat that just provides multiple layers in shade-grown coffee. You have the ground, the coffee shrubs, and the canopy trees that are providing a whole lot more strata for these birds to use. It kind of reminds me of woodlands here in Missouri, where when you thin some of those overstory trees, you bring prescribed fire to the landscape. You really encourage the shrubs on the ground to grow to create that additional nesting strata for shrub nesting birds that would not otherwise, those shrubs wouldn't be there unless you were doing the active management. And so in an active, frequently well-managed woodland, you have ground nesters, you have shrub nesters, and you have canopy nesters. So it's very similar to this. And each of these strata allow for foraging habitat, cover, and nesting for the birds endemic down there. These are some pictures of some of the birds you can find in shade coffee from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Living Bird magazine. You can see the Andean motmot, which of course is not a migratory bird. We aren't lucky enough to have this bird, but they're just stunning. I decided not to show too many tropical bird pictures. They're just so beautiful, but there's just not enough time. But then you see other things like this female summer tanager, which is familiar to us, and this Blackburnian warbler that are just found in the coffee. And so there's quite a bit of research out from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute, and Selva, this group we've worked with Ernesto Paz and Nick in Colombia, and they've conducted many bird surveys in these shade systems, comparing sun to shade, comparing shade coffee to forest. And so in the ornithological world, we have a pretty good grasp on what birds benefit from shade coffee and what birds use these areas on the overwintering grounds. So here are just some of the birds that we may consider our birds because they breed where we are, that use native shade grown coffee. And I've put the ones that breed in Missouri in orange boxes. The other ones breed north of us, either in the boreal or just golden wing warblers breed north of us in Minnesota and Wisconsin. But man, they are gorgeous. And when you see them like this, it's a bit easier to see that they are borrowed tropical birds, isn't it? Because they're so just striking and beautiful and bright and brilliant, which most of tropical birds are. They're just beautiful. So I've been incredibly fortunate to see our migratory birds on the wintering grounds in these areas, and it just does something to your soul to see birds that you only see for a few months of the year in big flocks, like seeing 10 Baltimore Orioles on the coffee farm in a tree at the same time. It's just something just blows up in your mind. It's just really incredible to see. And I've seen these birds on these sites with my own eyes, even on coffee. So you see here, Ernesto Carmen, his family owns a coffee farm. You can see I had to Photoshop his head in this picture because we have no picture of just the 4 of us. Pazarola, she's in Costa Rica as well. Nick Bailey, he's the director of migratory ecology at Selva headquarters in Bogota, Colombia. And so with these conservation partners, we've tagged golden wing warblers, you see on the bottom right, and wood thrush on the top right, with MODIS tags down on the wintering grounds to track their migration north through the US to their breeding grounds. And so you can see the tag here on the bird's back. And a few of our sites tagging these birds are in shade-grown coffee. Look at these plants behind this golden wing warbler. We're netting these birds in the middle of a shade coffee farm because it's providing great habitat for them. You know, standing around this farm of his family's, there's chestnut-sided warblers just bop around foraging on the coffee plants. They're just very common. Yeah, okay. So this is the shade coffee farm. But yes, this is where we're netting birds on the farm. Hey, look who it is. It's Dana. This is Paz. Dana came with us to help tag golden wings, which was awesome. And so these birds are moving through Missouri. We're finding this. So this is the important connection here. Shade coffee and Latin America tie us together with the breeding grounds. It's really incredible. So in spring 22, funded by a federal grant, you could see I still had the MDC triangle on my hat, so still with MDC at the time, but we got a federal grant for MODIS work. And I traveled down to Costa Rica with Dana and Kristen Heath-Aker, who's your new state ornithologist, to help Selva tag birds for this project. Now, when we were down in Costa Rica, we were there for a week, and we had to figure out how to trap the birds on the wintering grounds, which is quite different from the breeding grounds. Columbia Audubon Society separately funded a MODIS station in Columbia, in the heart of town where I live in Columbia, in honor of Brad Jacobs, who passed away in May 2020. And he was a huge advocate for migratory bird research. He was my predecessor's ornithologist at MDC, huge proponent of migratory bird work. This is a picture of him in Honduras. Okay, and so we tagged 25 birds. I was only, the three of us were only in Costa Rica for a week. We tagged 5 golden wing warblers out of the 25. Selva did the rest of the work. And so the first detection on the MODIS station in honor of Brad was a golden wing warbler. And not just any golden wing warbler, it was this exact bird in this picture that we helped process. So out of 5 birds that we tagged on the coffee farm of Ernesto's family, it flew right over the town where Brad lived and where I live. And at that time, there was one MODIS station in the center of the state. Now that is just wild. It was Brad in bird form, I'm convinced. And something that's really amazing is that we also detected this bird a week before in our Ozarks, showing a week-long stopover for that bird to fuel up and hang out in the area before it continued north, which is also incredibly valuable information. So it's pretty insane. Cut to the following spring, this last spring, 2023, I got another grant to fund 50 tags on golden wing warblers again, increase our sample on the wintering grounds with Selva again. And we placed a new MODIS station at Big Muddy National Wildlife Refuge, 20 miles west of Columbia. This is the first detection on this station was a golden wing warbler. And it wasn't any old golden wing warbler, but it was this exact bird, which was the 50th golden wing warbler as part of that grant tagged by Paz and Ernesto as part of our project. So this bird was detected on 3 stations in the center of the country. You can see the dates here. It was detected in Arkansas on the 1 MODIS station in the entire state. Then it was detected in Missouri, again showing a week-long stopover in our Ozarks between Arkansas and Missouri. And then later that day, on May 18th, it was detected in Iowa. So this bird, second year in a row, flew very close to Columbia, and it was tagged on the exact same shade coffee farm both years. And there were different birds, of course, but same tagging location on that same farm. It's pretty wild. Another MODIS tagging project looking at winter survival of cerulean warblers, comparing shade coffee, their survival on shade-grown coffee areas, and then in traditional forests. So overwinter survival is a huge knowledge gap for the species, for cerulean warblers. So they overwinter in the Andes of South America. We don't know anything about their survival. So we worked with Selva. We funded the tags for ceruleans from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And Selva tagged half the birds in traditional forest and half in shade coffee. And so the project is ongoing. This is the second year happening right now, to compare the occupancy and survival between those 2 very important habitats. And this project was funded by these entities on the screen. This was a 7-way partnership to fund Selva's time to tag these birds in the Andes, and they were all Missouri groups. And it's provided data new to science. So it's just really cool. Thank you to anyone who's part of those groups who contributed to that work. So we have to, these costs to farmers as part of these coffee farmers have to be considered. There are a lot of struggles in the coffee industry right now. Coffee is a massive import-export business that I really only understand a tiny part of, I recognize. But in the 1990s, there was a collapse in commodity coffee prices in Colombia that led to ramping up of the Sun coffee even more. And lots of farmers across Latin America abandoned coffee and shifted their coffee fields to cattle grazing. In many of these Latin American countries where coffee is grown, GDP per capita ranges from about $6,000 to $20,000. And so conservation really is a luxury. Most people are just trying to get by and feed their families. It's market driven. They're not trying to remove forest just because. They're trying to grow something and sell it to keep their families alive. So this is market driven. If you can make more money cutting down a few acres of your forest to grow avocados or graze cattle or other ag products because the market will get you more money for those, you listen in economies like this. So we have to consider market-based solutions and what is going to work for the farmer's bottom line. Same as conservation here on the breeding grounds as well. And so in shade coffee, you have lower production costs, decomposition of leaf litter, no pesticides, healthier soil, more nutrients with that decomposing, more moisture held in, decreases soil erosion. In a place like Costa Rica and other mountainous areas, you saw these pictures, landslides are a real thing. Like whole highways get shut down during the rainy season, and they just fix the road because, across the country, it's going to happen over and over again. But soil erosion is a big deal. And this coffee grows slower and it produces a higher quality taste. So you can get a higher market premium when you sell those beans and you can sell it at a higher price per pound. There's also greater carbon capture with canopy over top. Sun coffee, as we talked about, greater yields, but it's lower quality coffee. These areas do not fix nitrogen. And soil erosion, you saw those big mountainsides with sun coffee. They just don't have the root systems there that trees would provide. So by 2010, only 24% of the world's coffee was managed with traditional shade-grown practices, compared to 43% in 96. So this is a real need, especially for what we think of as our birds, where they're going for the winter. And again, we can't advocate for these improvements. I can't advocate for farmers to just grow shade coffee because it's the right thing to do, right? We have to consider the farmer's bottom line in this part of the world, especially. And, like I said, it's the same as conservation here. So I know this is a very wordy slide, but again, this is market-based. And without market incentives to maintain trees and shade over coffee, these existing market forces will continue to incentivize this sun coffee that removes this overstory habitat. So with researcher from Colombia, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology created a profit optimization model that showed that farmers can maximize their income by converting 36% of their plantings to shade grown, which is not the whole thing, it's an option. And they found that a single bird can save 23 to 65 pounds of coffee from boring beetles per hectare on a farm each year. And that's real money. So there is hope in this. The research has been done, but it's a whole nother ballgame to convince farmers to switch to this because it's unknown, it's different. You look at a lot of the ag systems up here on the breeding grounds too. A lot of it is what, their family did previous, and that passes down. Sometimes folks are really only convinced by word of mouth or seeing someone else do it. So it's the same thing down in this part of the world. But there are lots of international partners working on education resources, outreach to landowners on sustainable ag and agroforestry and sustainable grazing practices. There are a lot of good people out there trying their hardest down there in Latin America, and hats off to them. They work so hard for this area. So of course, with more tree species, you attract more of all of these wonderful things: water filtration, water storage. And really, it impacts the whole community surrounding you, not just the wildlife, but also to humans and people living on the landscape. So this is Finca Cristina. This is where we tag birds. And Ernesto is, of course, a birder and does a lot of conservation efforts. He's a bird guide as well. He's counted 341 species of birds, which is more than our entire state has throughout the entire year on their coffee farm. He's detected more than 250 species of butterflies, 30 species of reptiles and amphibians, and 55 species of orchid on 28 acres. It's just, I don't even know what to say about that. I have no frame of reference for the tropics. On 28 acres. So buy shade grow coffee. It's really important. Kind of speaks for itself. So again, it's really about maintaining this habitat for a variety of organisms, not just birds, but for diversity in general. And so there is hope here. I know it can seem very dire, but this is a way that we can directly impact this. There is hope. There's a ton of regional planning around Latin America there's a conservation investment strategy. The group that I'm part of, Partners in Flight, they're partners across the Western Hemisphere that work together on bird conservation. They just came up with a whole conservation plan for mid-elevational forests of Central America and South America. So it's just for that habitat type. And the key species are cerulean warbler, golden-winged warbler, and Canada warbler. Selva and the great folks at Selva have written publications that find key opportunity areas where we'll get the biggest bang for our buck conservation-wise, not only for birds, but they looked at mammals, they looked at reptiles and amphibians. There's these huge initiatives like the 5 Great Forests of Mesoamerica, where they're trying to reforest a lot of these areas where they're seeing a lot of rampant deforestation. The Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act is a federal U.S. grant program that gives about $5 million to international partners. It's not anywhere near enough, but at least it's something. And so there is hope, and there are a lot of things going on. So where do I buy bird-friendly coffee? There's a certification program by the Smithsonian where you can go online, you can find a retailer that sells it near you, you can buy this coffee directly online. So the researchers have shown the ecological benefits that we've talked about for the last 40 minutes. These researchers and economists have crunched the numbers to show a profitable strategy, but our role to play in all of this is the demand and actually putting some money towards this and purchasing this, because that's the only way it will drive this market. So this program, the Smithsonian Bird Friendly Certification Program, requires criteria for farms like canopy height, foliage cover, floristic diversity, structural diversity, leaf litter, buffer zones on waterways, and they need to be organic. They need to have organic certification. So it's a lot. It's a high bar. And to be fair, it can be expensive for a landowner to get this certification. And so I really encourage you to do your homework on a lot of these areas, because there are other bird-friendly farms out there that are not bird-friendly by the certification name. And some folks tell me, well, I buy fair trade. I thought that was the same thing, or I thought that held the same weight. But fair trade means that coffee has been audited through the supply chain to meet better trading conditions for coffee bean farmers. And so, you know, organic is pesticide free, but it's hard to investigate organic certifications abroad. It's hard to investigate them sometimes here, and it can be expensive, but it is possible. So I just encourage you to do a little bit of homework on where your coffee is coming from. There's even been research on how many birders are purchasing bird-friendly coffee, and it turns out it's not many. So if you love birds and you want to take action and do something today that will really have a direct impact on habitat or habitat removal, you know, native shade coffee is really, really important. And the reason that they found that birders are not buying shade coffee is because of a lack of awareness. So here you are, 165 people are now aware. So, and I know not everyone can afford it. It's a few dollars extra per pound, but it really, really is important. And it tastes really, really good. So yeah, sometimes certifications can be costly to the landowner. There are lots of coffee farms that are great for birds, so it may require a little bit of research. In Colombia, my friend Nick Bailey, I asked him for some recommendations. He said, look for single origin coffees from these areas. And so I can probably put that in the chat when we're done if you're interested in looking for coffees from those areas, because coffee from these places are much more likely to be grown under shade, even if they don't have that bird-friendly certification. Yeah, this is a lot of what I've said before. You know, we can all do something. If you can't afford bird-friendly coffee, that's fine. There's something all of us can do. You know, plant native plants where you are for birds. You know, the insects, the native insects that require these plants, will find them. If you don't have a backyard, you don't even have any yard, you can plant them in a pot on your balcony. There's something all of us can do at some level to help these birds. And I would really challenge you that we all need to do something very quickly, because they are declining very rapidly. Also talk to your local coffee shop about where the coffee's coming from. Tell them about bird friendly, tell them how it works. I think education is clearly a big key here. And Smithsonian Bird Friendly Program certification also has resources for importers, roasters, distributors. They have all this information so folks can plug in and find these beans from farmers that are doing this work. Continue your education. Look up a lot of these, some of these peer-reviewed publications can be kind of dense, but they include a lot of really cool information comparing bird species richness and bird abundance on these different types of areas. Spread the word and educate other coffee lovers. Buy them some bird-friendly coffee so they can taste it themselves. We're really able to support habitat directly with our purchasing power, and that's important. So that's the last slide I have. I just want to make a few comments here at the end. I hope I've given you some food for thought. In light of these bird declines and so many conservation challenges, it's really easy to become overwhelmed and really feel petrified by it, and that we're just frozen because we're just so weighed down by how much there is to consider. But I am really hopeful about this area of bird conservation, in particular on the wintering grounds and native shade coffee. We really can make a difference. I've seen it with my own eyes, these migrants in this habitat. So is Dana. And there are so many NGOs in Latin America and the US working toward education and outreach, reforestation efforts. I'm reading a book right now called Hope Matters, and I really recommend it. It's why hope is so essential in the environmental crisis. And this quote from it is that being hopeful in many ways is the more difficult path than despair and cynicism. Hope in its definition is active. There's an essential connection between hope and agency and our sense that we can take action. So let's do that and take action, because we cannot wait for someone else to act. We have to all do something where we can, and there's something scalable that we can all afford and all that we're all able to do for birds. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Sorry I went long.
You didn't go long. That was awesome. I love your hope quote at the end. Lots of really good comments in here, Sarah. I think that these aren't going to be the folks, if I know this audience at all by now, it's been some weeks, they're not going to be like the people in the study and ignore the potential impacts of bird-friendly shade-grown coffee. So we have several questions for you.
Okay.
A couple of them were about MODIS, and I had one question really quickly about MODIS as well. You showed a couple of maps of birds that pinged off of towers in Missouri. Yeah. Could you please just briefly comment on whether those birds went from their point of origin, all the way directly to Arkansas before pinging on a tower, or was that truly their flight, or did they stop in between and they just got to the first tower in Arkansas or in the Ozarks of Missouri?
Yeah, that's a good question. So MODIS is not able to directly track exact locations. It's working off of an array of receiver stations on the landscape. And so MODIS is only as strong as the network. So the more stations you put up, there's more points along the way that these birds can be detected if they fly within range of a station. And so, no, it was not a direct flight. If you go on MODIS, motus.org, you can look at receiver stations and look at a map with yellow dots all over it. Those are all the active MODIS stations. If you click on those, you can see the exact time and date that a bird was detected. You can click on the bird's ID and see its whole track. So no, it was not a direct flight. There are many areas still that need more MODIS stations. And so because the stronger the network, the more data we'll be able to get, and it's for the greater good. Any MODIS station you put up, any MODIS tag bird or bat or insect or whatever that anyone tags across the hemisphere can be detected on that station. So it's a really cool system there. I gave a whole hour-long talk about that on the MRBO last year's winter webinar series that is probably still on their YouTube page if you would like to learn more. Good question.
Quick related MODIS question: how close to a tower does a tag bird need to fly?
It depends. If a MODIS station has a big antenna and a perfectly clear line of sight in an open landscape with no obstructions, it can reach like 10 miles in the direction that the antenna is pointed. Ours in Missouri are pointed east-west to try and get birds moving north-south. So depends on many factors, like all MODIS things.
Ethan, did you have a comment, I thought?
Well, I have a comment, but I think we can do a speed round on these, a lightning round on these Q&As, right, and just kind of bang them out. And I see there's one related to chimney swifts there. Of course, they're another migratory bird dealing with all sorts of challenges. And the chimney capping is definitely one of the challenges. I don't know if Sarah has any particular talking points on that. I have a link I can put in the chat about that.
No, that would be great. I think an alternative to capping is to cap the chimney at the base, is to cap the chimney at the flue by your house. You may still hear birds in your chimney, but you're providing a nesting substrate for chimney swifts because they are declining very rapidly. Again, we're not sure why. We're not even sure where chimney swifts go in the wintering season because they're hard to catch and to track. So there's a lot of unknowns about chimney swifts, but we know that most chimneys are capped. Most buildings being put up do not require chimneys just because of how the building is heated. And so if you have a chimney and you are not bothered by chirping birds for about a month, which I'm not, our chimney is not capped, and we had the joy of hearing chimney swifts in our chimney 2 years ago. But you can cap it down at the base so the birds don't get in your house and nothing else gets in your house either, but it's just still providing the top part of the chimney. How many birds eat coffee berries? And so that was part of the beginning of the talk, is that coffee cherries have caffeine, which is an alkaloid, and it keeps both insects away, but birds really don't eat it. They really didn't evolve with coffee because coffee is from Africa. And so they really don't eat the berries, and most of these species are insectivorous. So they're looking for insects, at least the migrants. So really the birds are like an added bonus on your farm because they're eating those coffee borers.
So there's a fairly potentially complex-ish question about photoperiod and the role it plays in migration. If you want to tackle that one.
Yes, they are finding that some birds, especially vireos, you may have to double check me on that, are starting to migrate earlier by like a week or two, which can have effects with all of these precipitation and weather event fluctuations. We can have cold snaps later, you know, so the birds make it up here and then they could potentially die if there's cold snaps and they aren't able to find enough insects. There's a lot of work done by Audubon showing, you know, different scenarios of temperature changes and how birds' ranges will shift. But the timing is certainly a concern in the face of climate change, that birds will start migrating earlier or later because of these different weather patterns. And then when they get here, they may not have what they need. Trees may not be leafed out yet, you know. So things are changing potentially at a rate fast. Well, we know they're changing at a faster rate that birds can account for them, adapt to them, and evolve to them. So that's, I think, the biggest, one of the biggest challenges in the face of climate change. At least learning from Ernesto down in Latin America, one of the things that has been affected by climate change is that coffee used to be kind of a lower elevation plant. And now it's kind of creeping up the mountainsides because of warming temperatures to get at those cooler temperatures for coffee. And so they're starting to cut into forest like higher and higher up in elevation up the mountainside, which of course, which species use that mid-elevation gradient? A lot of our migratory birds use that mid-elevation gradient. And so it's starting to kind of impact some of the habitat at that elevation.
Couple of very specific coffee related questions. Aaron asks, can you talk more on why all shade grown coffee is not bird friendly? And before I lost it in the chat, if you know of Starbucks or any other major, you know, well-known coffee chains, if you know anything about their policy on the topic.
I do not know of any large name brand coffee company that sells shade grown other than the ones that are specifically bird friendly. Starbucks does not. But I mean, most coffee, I think it's an education issue. And it may cost a bit more to buy the beans from a bird friendly farm. So there is a cost associated with this at all levels, right? Our purchasing, the roaster or the distributors purchasing, but they can also charge more for that. And I really do believe that people would pay $1 more or 50 cents more. And you can put up a little education sign in your coffee shop that says, this coffee is bird friendly. This is what the heck that even means, you know? And I think that would just be really interesting to many people, not just people who love birds. And so I think there's a lot to be done there, but I mean, none of this is going to change because no one's being forced to be changed. So I would just bring it up a lot. I would talk to your your local coffee shop. That's a great first start, wherever you buy your coffee from. Or if they're not willing to do that, just switch to a bird-friendly or native shade-grown coffee and just purchase it yourself. I know there's a cost to having it shipped also, but you're buying directly, you know where your coffee's coming from, and you know that it's benefiting birds. What was the rest of that question? Oh, why all shade-grown coffee is not bird-friendly? That's a great question, because not all shade over top of coffee is robust native trees. I took out a slide that kind of showed some kind of sparse, kind of wimpy shade over coffee. And it was just kind of sparse trees that may count for some certifications. It wouldn't for the Smithsonian bird-friendly certification, but you know, just having shade coffee, that's another certification that I'm not sure who gives out that certification. But they can just put up any old tree, right? It doesn't have to be native. It doesn't have to be big and bushy, providing habitat, you know, they can just put up any tree. And while that is better than sun coffee, right, there's a gradient here. But that's why, because not all shade is the native shade that's providing really good habitat and food source, because native trees bring native insects, which we all know, because of our great native plant work here in Missouri. But that's a really good question. And there are, like I said, a lot of farms that are, quote, bird friendly that don't have that bird friendly certification. You know, they have native shade over top. They are providing a lot of great habitat for our migrants, but maybe that certification is too pricey. Maybe that farmer doesn't need it because they're selling just fine, you know, but there is certainly demand for folks to buy it. I think that there are people doing native shade coffee, but we kind of need to step up and show that we as consumers want that, because that is powerful.
Joanna has an interesting question about how common is it for the shade-grown coffee farms to be managing / harvesting other plants and crops, like basically implementing a perennial polyculture concept. Any examples of other crops?
It's very common. So I know on Finca Cristina, where we are trapping birds, they grow, Ernesto has gone around and put a lot of different other plants on the coffee, on the trees that are shading the coffee. He'll grow like vanilla up the shade trees. I took it out because I had like 60 something slides. It was too much. There's so much I want to say all the time. And so I took it out, but we had a release video of Golden Wing Warbler when Dana was there, and we caught this bird in a patch of vanilla on the coffee farm. They just, you know, taken out this like 20 by 40 square feet area and planted lines of vanilla, you know, under the shade and as part of the coffee farm. But there's cacao plants and everything. So it's very common, very, very common for people to fold other types of agriculture into their coffee farms. Yeah. Because it's just so, things grow so easily, you know, it's just so easy to do that. And it's not at the expense of something else. So it's a lot easier for things to be much more diverse in a tropical climate.
So Sarah, we have a couple of like other like ecologically related questions. If you can get to them, I know we're like over time already, and I know that Ethan, I think, had a comment or question coming from somewhere as well. So however y'all want to proceed.
I have like a minute left. But I'm trying to find the other, I'm not a good person to ask about honeysuckle replacements. What do we offer while we're removing it? I'm not the right person to ask about that. I would ask Missouri Prairie Foundation and the Grow Native program.
Grow Native program. Yep, we can put that in the chat.
Yep, I got the link right here.
No, that's a good question.
And Sean, I actually think that based on the some questions and some suggestions by people attending this webinar series, I think we're actually going to do an entire webinar on cats. Probably someone from American Bird Conservancy.
Yep, I just put a link from them in the chat too.
Nice. Yeah. That's great.
Yep, a lot of definitely concerns about chimneys, not germane completely to this topic, but a lot of concerns. I put some links out there for chimney swifts, which is really near and dear to my heart. The woman that got me interested in birds and bird watching was a rescuer of swifts in England. And it's just it's an important thing to be able to try to help them out, but not necessarily germane to this topic. And then I would just, the comment that I did have was that Sarah has been instrumental with the Modus work and a lot of other conservation efforts like these ones you've heard about here. And she's just been a tremendous colleague and somebody that's really amazingly humble and that you can joke around with. And we appreciate her very much. And I just wanted to make sure that was said.
You guys are so sweet. No, the feeling's mutual completely. Yeah, you guys are great.
You're a rock star.
Also, all of these things, Sarah, that you've talked about and that other speakers have talked about, everyone, we don't want to be up here 20 years from now being like, our birds are still declining. Habitat is still like, we'll probably be coming to you as holograms by that point. So like, let's all work together to not have these same declines go on.
And there's things that Sarah may not be able to say with her badge on for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but we at Mervo can. And another thing is like just pay attention to things in voting and policy. Like agriculture policy matters. Agricultural policy we can't vote on in Central and South America, but we can do here for the limited time birds are here, and other things like that, other conservation issues. Pay attention to policy, not politics.
I'm just reading these comments. Everybody's so awesome. I don't know if Rachel's still on here, but Rachel is our good friend and she always wants me to talk about wingspan. Every single time I give a bird talk, she goes, "Do you talk about wingspan?" I was like, "No, that really wasn't at the top of my list." But everybody check out the board game Wingspan because it's really fun. There, finally I got it in there.
Sweet.
That's great. No, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the invite. And thank you for all that you do and for being such great conservation partners in the state. You guys are awesome.
Thank you for your time and your work.
Yeah. Yay, everybody go make good conservation choices.
Drink decaf tonight and caffeinated in the morning. Night, everybody.
Bye, thanks.